get this recording. And I haven't had a chance to look at that quiz question that you brought up again, Wesley, but I will. I told you I will, and I will. And the recording of class from last time got messed up, so that's also why that one hasn't gotten posted yet. If you've looked for that, when I switch back and forth from YouTube videos, the camera shuts off, and then sometimes I forget to turn it back on. So I'll probably have to find one from last year, well, 2 years ago, because I wasn't here last year, like I have for the other one. So that's why I haven't posted that yet. But okay. All right. Well, today we're talking about the blood vessels. So we're moving away from the heart, still in the cardiovascular system. This is an image from there's these special anatomy exhibits that I know maybe some of you have been to. There was one that was just called Bodies, that was traveling around the world for quite a while. But they have full humans with just the blood vessels. And this is an example of one of those. But yeah, it's pretty amazing to look at. I mean, it's if when you see the full thing, it's just wild because it's like a full human being, but all you see is a blood vessel. Somehow they've taken everything else out. I have no idea how they prepare those models for that. But they have ones that are just the nervous system, skeletal system. That's obvious, but to hold the body together with just blood vessels is pretty crazy. But you can see how dense some of those areas are, right? Like the lungs and the kidneys and all those different areas. But yeah, that's what we're talking about today. So, in regards to just how many blood vessels there are, what do you think here? Take a guess, chat with each other about it for a sec. All right, go ahead and send that in if you haven't yet. Send something in. All right, anybody else? Okay, so we got about half of you saying D, quarter of you saying E, another 20% saying C. So, yeah, it is the biggest option there. So it's 60,000 miles inside of each of us. Okay. The image you see on the back of the slide, the one we were just looking at, those are just the ones you can see with your eyes, right? The vast majority of our blood vessels are microscopic, right? They are capillaries, and that's 90-ish% of our vascular system is the little microscopic ones that only a single red blood cell fit through at a time. Single red blood cells go through in a single file line. Yeah, but that inside of each of us, it would go around the world 2.5 times, right? That's inside of each of us, right? It's about 25,000 miles to go around the world once, 2.5 times, right? So this just makes me think of this, right? Because it's not only that we have just a bunch of blood vessels, it's that we control where the blood goes, right? Like our body is intricately controlling where the blood's being sent, where it's not being sent, right? And this is obviously an anatomist's favorite verse, right? But it's always shows up in anatomy. But Psalm 139, right? For you created my inmost being, you knit me together in my mother's womb. I praise you because I'm fearfully and wonderfully made. Your works are wonderful, and I know that full well. Right? So the vascular system, it's just another beautiful example of that. We've got a lot of them, but this is another one. So yeah, so let's talk about the different types of blood vessels that we have. Okay, there's 3 main types, which are our arteries, right? As you already know, those are going away from the heart. Capillaries, that's kind of the in between arteries and veins. That's where all of the business of the vascular system happens, right? That's where we can pick stuff up, drop stuff off. If it's not in a capillary, nothing's leaving, right? You can't diffuse things out of your large arteries, your large veins, okay? Obviously, our veins are coming back towards the heart. We have this other kind that you guys have seen in the lab, right? Did you guys talk about, well, maybe not. Maybe have you guys gotten to the circle of Willis part and all that yet? Yeah? No, yeah, that might be this week, actually. But an anastomosis is when 2 different blood vessels merge together that we wouldn't necessarily expect to merge together. Okay, so we can have a few options of that. An arterial anastomosis An example of this is in what's in the brain, which is called the circle of Willis. This is like you got an artery coming up to give oxygen and blood to one certain part of your brain, but there's also an artery that comes from the other side of your brain that connects back to that same artery. And this happens in a circular fashion in your brain. So just in case we get a clot going up to this one and this part gets blocked, right, then we can still get blood to that by coming the other direction, right? It's kind of like a backup route to get blood to very, very important places like our brain. Okay, so that's the arterial type. We also have what's called an arteriovenous anastomosis, which the name explains it, right? It goes from artery to vein. What's normally in the middle is a capillary bed, right? So in this case, we're skipping the capillary bed, going directly from artery to vein. So that means in this case, the blood that went through that shunt didn't have an opportunity to drop off any oxygen, pick up any CO2, but that's also known as a shunt. Okay, we have lots of these in our capillary beds. A lot of times capillary beds aren't open and we just send the blood right through because we don't need to drop anything off in that area. All right. And then a venous anastomosis, we have lots of these actually on the venous side of our vascular system. As maybe you guys have noticed in the cats, it's just a lot less organized on the venous side than it is on the arterial side. The arterial side, very clear, named arteries for the most part, typically always in almost the same spot in all the different specimens. But on the venous side, it's just kind of very mixed up and lots of extra ones sometimes, a lot of veins connecting to other veins. And that's just kind of how the venous side of the vascular system is. Okay. Good. Yeah. All right. So go ahead and label these things here. We've got a few of these examples, and then you can answer this question here on your clicker. Okay, go ahead. That the two people are missing and one sit by each other. That's funny. All right, so you're sending in the answer to that question there in the top. Give you about another 10 seconds. All right, looks like most of you are in there. And about 3/4 of you said C is the answer to this one here. That is correct. That is what's known as a circle of Willis, which is this grouping of blood vessels up in our brain that have that exact function, serve as a protective mechanism to make sure we get blood supply to all parts of the brain, even if we got one side that's blocked off. Okay, so which one did you think was artery? Which letter? B. Yeah, we got B there for sure. Okay. And then vein. A. Capillary. F, good. And then arterial anastomosis, that was what we were just talking about, right? That's C. Venous anastomosis, D. So we see a lot of those there on the venous side, right? This is a good example right here where it kind of just connects back here, connects here, connects here. Multiple places where those veins are connecting to each other without actually going to a capillary bed in the middle. Yeah. And then the arterial venous shunt, which letter is that one? Which one? E, yeah, the last one. Yeah. So that's the, it's also called a meta-arterial, but also just called a shunt, right? We're skipping the capillary bed. Blood just passes right through there. We'll see more of this in a second, but you see these little rings right here. These are smooth muscle rings that will either open or close depending on the situation there around that capillary bed. And so if that area that the capillary bed serves requires a lot of oxygen in that time, like there's a lot of metabolism going on, then those will open up. So blood goes out into the capillary bed. But if not, then they can just stay shut and the blood just passes right through the center in that anastomosis, and we just don't send the blood through the capillaries. So, okay. Questions on any of these categories so far? Okay. All right. So then when we look at the overall kind of general structure of all of our vascular system, we have a few different layers of blood vessel walls. Okay. So the most external one called the tunica externa, right? So a tunic is like something on the outside of that we wear on the outside of our bodies, right? So this is the idea here, all the different layers of this, but the most external one is the tunica externa, right? Also known as the adventitia. This is the thickest, kind of the toughest, the most protective layer. Okay. This is connective tissue. Tunica media is the one in the middle. This one is all smooth muscle. Okay. And smooth muscle that's circularly arranged, just like the little rings we just saw, kind of wraps around the outside. It can pinch off certain areas in certain cases. Yeah. So that's the whole point of that, is to be able to change the size of a blood vessel to cause vasoconstriction or vasodilation. Okay. And so when we contract the smooth muscle, that leads to vasoconstriction, which is going to decrease flow beyond it, right? We're kind of creating more resistance there by making that blood vessel smaller, making it harder to send blood through that area. If we relax that smooth muscle, it opens up a little bit. That's how we get vasodilation. And then we're going to increase flow beyond that because there's less resistance now. Okay, so that's our middle layer. Then our internal layer is called our tunica intima, also known as the interna. Okay, this is very, very smooth and continuous. Okay. The kind of fascinating part about this is if we think about that 60,000 miles of blood vessels, it's one continuous layer through all 60,000 miles of blood vessels in this layer, in this tunica intima. And it's all these little cells called endothelial cells. Okay. So does anybody remember what type of tissue this was an example of in the histology section last semester? Say it again. Okay, we got one layer of cells, so what would we call it? Simple, okay, and then they're pretty flat. So what do we call those? Simple squamous, right? Simple squamous cells. So this is one of those examples of that, okay? And so it's just endothelial cells with this little basement membrane. And it just turns out that these little cells are the most important thing when it comes to development of cardiovascular disease in people. And so the number one thing that kills people in all of Western civilization is heart attacks, strokes, cardiovascular disease, right? And these little cells are kind of the root of that disease, really. And so, yeah, so endothelial dysfunction is really the first step in the progression of atherosclerosis, which is the hardening of our arteries and plaque buildup. And then that's really what eventually will lead to a heart attack or stroke. And so health of these little cells is of the utmost importance for us. Okay. Questions on any of that? The next slide just has the opportunity to label those layers. So feel free to flip over to that while I'm letting the last couple of people write this down. Okay, and you can answer that clicker question up there as well. So here we can see the three main types of vessels we talked about: arteries, capillaries, and veins. and we can see what those layers look like in each of those. All right, so you're sending in the answer to this question here on the top. Which layer is the only one that capillaries have? Capillaries only have one of the three layers, whereas arteries and veins have all three, we talked about. And send that in, give you about another 5 seconds. All right. Good. Looks like most of you are in there, and about half of you are saying A, which is the correct answer. Oops, sorry. Yeah, so A, that tunica intima is the most internal layer. You can see down there in the capillaries, that's all they've got. There's no smooth muscle there. There's none of that external, thicker, tougher layer. It's just the endothelial cells and then that little basement membrane behind it. Okay, so A was tunica intima. B is that middle layer, tunica media, where we have that smooth muscle. And that varies, right? It tends to be much thicker in arteries than it does in veins, right? Some veins don't have much smooth muscle at all. And then it varies within the arteries too. Some arteries have a lot thicker smooth muscle, other ones have small, and we'll talk about some of those details in a sec. But the more smooth muscle it has, then typically the more ability it has to change size. It also gives it a thickness and a toughness to it as well. And then C is that tunica externa there that we can see in both. One thing that's unique about veins is they have valves in them, right? And that's what D is there. D is a valve, and that's just like a thickening of the endothelial cells that creates this little valve that makes sure blood's only going one direction. And I'll show you. We'll get into that more soon. Okay, questions on any of these? Okay. All right. So if we just look at kind of this pie chart here of where the majority of our blood sits or is at any given time, this would be at rest for sure, not during exercise. But we can see that over half of our blood is out in our veins, right? And so the venous side of our vascular system serves as a reservoir for blood. So we'll talk a little bit more about that function later. But we have a lot of it just kind of sitting out there. And then when we go to exercise and we need to increase our cardiac output, then we can squeeze down those veins and kind of mobilize some of this blood pool and get more blood going back to our core. But a good chunk of it just sits out there in the veins, kind of moving slowly through, not much. Okay, but let's talk about each of these in a little bit more detail. So let's start on the arterial side. Okay. Obviously, in the arteries, they're smaller as they move. They get smaller as they move away from the heart, right? Makes sense. On both sides, it's the biggest ones are the ones closest to the heart. Okay. In arteries, the media is the largest. Okay. So that meaning that that smooth muscle layer is the thickest one out of those three. Okay. This gives it some toughness, some support, which helps because arteries have much higher blood pressure in them than veins do. Because blood pressure is created by the heart, and this is on that side of the vascular system where we're getting that blood pumped right into them from the heart. Okay. But then also arteries have the ability to change their size a lot more than veins do. And so the smooth muscle helps with that. Okay. Arteries are both elastic and contractile. Okay. So what does that mean? Passive, when they get stretched out, then they want to bounce back. That's the elasticity part. Okay. So they get stretched out because of the heart beating. Okay. But then that bounces back right away. Okay. And this serves to keep the speed of the blood flow moving. Okay. So when you guys take your pulse, right? Everybody feel their radial pulse real quick, kind of right above your, if you feel your tendons in your wrist on the anterior side, then just shift towards your thumb a little bit. You'll feel that little radial pulse most likely. Do it with 2 fingers, right? That's the same stretch that started up at your aorta when your heart beat it, right? When your heart beat it, yeah. Yeah, I guess that's it, right? Is it beaten? I don't know. The past tense, beat? Yeah, just beat. It's just beat. Sorry. When your heart beat, it stretched out the aorta, right? And that same stretch went all the way down through your vascular system, and then you're feeling it hit right there in your artery, right? But it didn't just stretch out; it also bounced back. And when it does that, it pushes the blood kind of from behind and keeps it going fast, right? And that's actually really helpful for maintaining your blood pressure and keeping the blood flow moving. So it's important that they can stretch, and then it's important that it bounces back, right? And then the contractile part is mostly controlled by our sympathetic nervous system. That's what the SNS is there for, right? So when we have more sympathetic nervous system activity, that causes overall lots of constriction of our arteries. When we have less sympathetic nervous system activity, we get less constriction or dilation. Okay, we talked about this when we talked about the autonomic nervous system, right? We want to have high blood pressure when we're stressed out, right? When we're exercising, when we're running from something, when we're stressed, we want to be able to move the blood fast to wherever we need to get it. And we got to have high blood pressure to do that. So we do that by shrinking down our arteries. Okay, so the artery types. We have what's known as our elastic arteries, also known as our conducting arteries. They have a big open part in the middle. That's the lumen, right, where the blood passes through, right? So that means we can get a lot of blood in these quickly. Okay. Function of these is just that, get a lot of blood somewhere fast, right? So which ones are these? These are the massive ones you've been looking at right around the heart, right? The aorta, all the big branches that go up towards your brain and towards your arms, right? And then the aorta goes down through the abdomen, right? And so it's just those very large arteries that are sending lots of blood, just distributing them to all over the body. Okay, so as far as the layers go, the externa is pretty thin. Okay, because they're so thick that they don't really need like a solid external layer to hold them in place, because there's lots of very thick muscle in these arteries, and so that gives them all the structure and support they need. Okay, so they're very thick, very elastic. Why? Because this helps them to handle high blood pressure. Right? Because this is where the highest blood pressure is going to be, because they're the closest to the heart. And so we need them to be strong to be able to handle that high blood pressure and not burst. Okay, and then the intima is also relatively thick, again, giving that artery some support under the high blood pressure. Okay, so those are our biggest types of arteries, our elastic or conducting arteries. Okay, give you another sec to finish writing that down. Okay, and then we've got the muscular arteries, also known as distributing arteries. These are kind of somewhere in the middle as far as size of the lumen. Okay, the function of these is to really, like it sounds, just distribute blood to the kind of all the little corners of our body. Okay, these are most of the named ones outside of the ones right next to the heart that you guys worked on in lab and are working on in lab. Okay, so you can see the kind of details of the layers there. A thicker externa, also a very thick media, and then some strength and elastin fibers there in the intima to give it that ability to stretch and bounce back. And then finally, our arterioles, these are the smallest ones. These are very, very important for regulating blood flow to the capillaries. And there's just a lot more of these than there are the other ones we've talked about so far. And they have a lot of smooth muscle. So that means they can change size a lot. And since there's so many of them and they have a lot of smooth muscle, they can change size. We have a good chunk of our blood in these. So these are actually the primary site of blood pressure regulation in our body, right? So when we talk about sympathetic nervous system ramping up, causing our blood pressure to increase, we're talking mostly about these arterioles constricting, and that they do a lot to control our blood pressure. Okay, so most blood pressure regulation occurs in these arterioles. Okay, the next slide is labeling those. So hop over there if you're ready, but I'll leave this up for a sec. Okay. There's a clicker question there for you to answer as well.
Question. So when they talk about applying pressure to a pressure point, are they referring to an arterial? If they're trying to control a hemorrhage, for example?
Oh, yeah, is that what you're talking about
Yeah,
for
in
blood?
that case,
Yeah, and the one, no, in that case, it's, yeah, it could be arterial, it could be just like one of the distributing arteries too. Yeah, depends on where it's at. If you're like here in the brachial artery, that would be a distributed artery, right? So if you're femoral artery, you know, someone breaks their femur and that's a distributed artery. That's a big artery for sure. Arterioles are very small. They're right before the capillary bed. So
so it's the big,
it'd probably be one step up above the arterioles, more of those distributed arteries. Yeah. Definitely applying pressure smashes down anything in that area. But when you break arterioles, you're not as worried about them bleeding a ton, but as distributing an artery, you could lose a lot of blood fast. Yeah.
because again, that's where high pressure is.
Yeah, much higher pressure and just bigger lumen too. So just a lot more flow. So it's really hard to clot that. Smaller arteries, the clot works quicker because it's small, you know, you can kind of bridge that gap easier. Yeah, good question. You got up there for right after the sunset, probably, huh? Okay, yeah, so pretty, huh? Yeah.
So nice. And
Beautiful.
the clouds were so like, I don't know, it was so dark, but it was so bright. Like the sunset
Yeah.
was so bright.
Yeah, that was a glorious end of the day. It's kind of scary the way it rocks. And it was kind of scary. Yeah.
I think that
All right, so go ahead and send in your answer there on the clickers. About 10 or so more of you need to send that in. All right. You guys are a little bit all over the place on this one. Let me show you. So what if we just did, what if I change it to blood? That says pressure, sorry. What if I change it to blood pressure? Does that change your answer? Change your answer if you think that needs to change your answer. Talk to each other about it for a sec on your team. If it says blood pressure instead of blood flow. All right, so we're honing in on C and D there, so that's good. So we moved away from A and B by changing that word up. So yeah, pressure is definitely more what I was getting at here. Flow would be very related to this too, but yeah, so A, what'd you call A? Yeah, those big ones, elastic or conducting arteries. Okay, those are just getting a lot of blood out to eventually be distributed, but not distributed yet because B is the next one. But those are the distributing arteries, right? And then, yeah, some of you are just mixed up with what C is versus D, right? In this case, C is the arterioles, okay, also known as resistance vessels, right? So that would be where the most blood pressure control occurs, is in those arterioles. Yeah, D, it tells you there is that arteriovenous anastomosis, right? But it's also just known as a meta-arterial. The picture you saw before had it going through the middle of the capillary bed. This one has it going through like the top of the capillary bed. There's probably some variation in the way that works anatomically, but either way, this is the one that just skips the capillary bed instead, right? So it's not actually leading to the capillary bed like the arterial is right there. Okay, questions on that? Okay. Any questions? Good? But- Say it again. So meta-arterial is the same thing as, when we go back here to this one that had all the anastomoses, it's the same thing as this one. So the arterial venous shunt is also just another name for a meta-arterial. Sorry, that didn't really help writing it on top of other things, but yeah. It's where we go from artery to vein, right? So from the arterial side to the venous side, we skip the capillary bed. Meta-arterial is just another name for that. Okay, other questions on that? Okay, so now let's talk about the capillaries. Okay, so talk about the artery side. Let's talk about the capillary side. Okay, so capillaries are found between arterioles, which we just talked about, and then the equivalent of that on the venous side, which is called venules. Okay, the function of these is to do all the exchange that we think of when we think of the vascular system, right? Dropping off oxygen, picking up CO2, dropping off glucose, amino acids, lipids, all those things our cells are going to need, right? Picking up waste products, dropping off hormones, right? Like we talked about with the endocrine system, all those things that make the vascular system our transport system of the body. This is where stuff gets out and gets in. Okay, so the structure of these again is just that endothelium wall only. Doesn't have a smooth muscle layer. The media doesn't have the externa either. Just has that little endothelial layer. Okay, and so when we see these meta-arterioles again, the same idea. This is that arteriovenous anastomosis. This is what's going to skip the capillary beds. Okay, but then the true capillary beds themselves are anywhere from 10 to 100 little tiny blood vessels, right? Very, very small, as I mentioned before. Only a single red blood cell fits through at a time, right? So microscopic, for sure. Okay, and like I mentioned before, we got these little rings of smooth muscle around them, which are sphincters, precapillary sphincters. Okay, so when we open these up, then the blood goes into the capillary bed for all the exchange stuff to happen. But we can also keep these closed, and then it's going to force the blood to go through that meta-arterial instead, through that anastomosis, and no exchange can happen. Okay. All right. Well, let's talk about the capillary types. Okay. So we've got three primary types of capillaries in the body. Number one is called continuous. Okay. We find these in our brain, the central nervous system. They help us create the blood-brain barrier. Find them in our skin and our muscle. The two main functions of these types are, number one, we want to create a solid seal between the vascular system and whatever tissue that is that it's supplying to. But then we also want to allow for diffusion, right? We want to allow things to pass through, but we kind of really want to control what goes through and what doesn't go through. Okay, so those are our continuous capillaries. Okay, and then we have fenestrated capillaries. means they have holes inside of the cells. Like the cells are not just a continuous thing. There's actually little holes that things can pass through. Okay. So certain size objects and solutes and things can actually just go right through, right? And so we find these in places where we want to, where we're actually pulling things out of the blood and adding things to the blood. Okay. So places where we're doing active absorption, which means like taking stuff and adding it to the blood, like our digestive system, right? We're pulling nutrients out of the digestive system, putting it into the blood, or we're adding things to the urine, taking it out of the blood. So like in our kidneys, right? So in the kidneys are there to filter our blood, right? Endocrine glands, we have to have capillaries big enough to allow the hormones that those endocrine glands secrete to pass through the endothelial walls to get in. Okay. And then the intestines, right? We're absorbing those nutrients that we're eating and digesting. Okay. So that's still some level of control of what comes in and what comes out, but a little bit less control there. And then we have what's called the sinusoidal capillaries. And these are holes in the cells, but also gaps between the cells. So lots of opportunity for things to pass through, lots of permeability. Large things like whole cells can get through here, large proteins. Okay. So we have these in areas of our body that are designed to deal with the cells of the blood in one way or another, right? Bone marrow is where all of our blood cells are made. So we got to have big enough holes in the capillaries in our bones to allow those cells to get in, right? The liver is also responsible for processing red blood cells. And then the spleen is very important for red and white blood cells. And so those things have to make it through the holes in the capillary beds. So we see that there. Okay. All right. Label these capillary types here. Take a guess on what you think might be the most common out of those three. Go ahead.
Yeah, maybe on the schedule because I'm
Sounds good.
been freaking out. I'm not making my hours, unfortunately.
Okay. Yeah, sounds good. All right, just send that one in on your clickers. Which one you think's probably the most common? All right, go ahead and send that in if you haven't yet. All right, so about 80% of you are saying B there would be the most common. So what, first let's start with A. What do we call A? Yeah, that'd be the sinusoidal, right? Because we got holes, pretty good sized holes in the cells themselves, but also gaps between the cells, right? And then B, which one do you think that was? Continuous, yep. And those are definitely the most common type. It's the majority of what they are. And then C finally is those fenestrated ones, where there's not necessarily gaps between the cells, but lots of little pores in the cells to allow things to pass through. Okay, questions on any of those capillaries? Okay, all right, this just kind of shows an open capillary bed versus a closed one, right? So this would be the open side over here, right? Blood's allowed to go over here, whereas the closed one is just passing through the center no blood is over there in the capillary bed, right? So this would be, the first one would be opening up of these precapillary sphincters. Second one is closing down those precapillary sphincters. Okay. All right, so our last blood vessel type is the venous side of our vascular system. Okay, so these are obviously increasing in size as they move towards the heart, which is kind of the same thing as the arteries, but blood's just traveling in the other direction, right? Once closer to the heart we are, the bigger they are, but we're moving closer to the heart and getting bigger as we go. Okay, so the function of these obviously bringing blood back to the heart. Okay, but also, as I mentioned early on with that pie chart, is this serves as kind of this reservoir for blood, allows for some pooling of blood. Always have more blood in our veins than we do in our arteries. But again, when we need some extra blood flow, we need to increase our cardiac output during exercise, then we can vasoconstrict the veins. They don't have as much smooth muscle as the arteries do, but they have some. So we can squeeze them down a little bit, send some of that blood back to our core, then we got more in circulation to work with. That's one of the biggest ways we increase our end diastolic volume, like we were talking about last time, right? In order to increase our stroke volume, we've got to increase our preload, right? Which is measured by end diastolic volume. One of the ways we do that is by mobilizing this blood pool, getting more blood to come back to the heart. Okay. The other way we do it is something called the muscle pump. Okay. So veins don't have much pressure in them at all because all the pressure comes from the heart, right? And then we get all the way down to those little microscopic capillaries. And then by the time it gets over to the venous side, if we had any pressure at all in the capillaries, then it would have burst those capillaries because they're super fragile. Okay. So the pressure is completely gone. So now we're just relying on gravity and other things to help get that blood back towards our heart in our veins. And so one of the ways that we do that is veins are all around muscles, between your muscles and your skin and things like that. And so when your muscles contract, it smashes down your veins and it creates some pressure and pushes blood really both directions. But since they have, like it's shown here, pinching down that vein, right? But since there's this little valve right here, right? That's a valve there. Blood will try to push both directions when we squeeze it down, but it's going to hit that valve here and then turn back around and only go this direction, right? And the valves are really helpful because it kind of sequentially gets blood closer and closer back to the heart, right? We push it past one valve and then it can't go any further. And then we push it past the next one and it keeps going, right? And so that helps us get that blood back, okay? And so, yeah, this is obviously because of the valves. Okay. A lot of the research I did during my PhD dissertation was with working with arteries, and we this is an image of a high resolution ultrasound machine. We would always measure the brachial artery right here in your arm, and this is the brachial artery right here. We put a little ultrasound machine over that. This little Doppler senses the blood flow. We can measure the speed of the blood flow, how much actual volume of blood's passing through. So that's a brachial artery. But every once in a while, we would go to get a good view of the vein too. And so right down here is actually the brachial vein. We don't normally see the brachial vein that well. But what you can see here is the valve really clearly. So I'll play the video, and right where that little circle is, you'll see this little like flap going up and down. And it just so happens that every time the heart beats, the artery stretches out, just like we talked about with your radial artery, right? The artery stretches out a little bit, which then pushes down on this vein a little bit. And that's just kind of like the muscle pump, but it happens all through your body because the artery stretches, smashes your vein down, pushes a little bit of blood back. So you can see that little valve here in a sec. See those little leaflets kind of flopping open and closed. And if you watch it closely, it corresponds with the little graph on the bottom. Every time it spikes up, we see the valve opening and closing. So kind of a cool little shot there. Yeah, so there's a little vein. See right where that little red circle is. Okay. All right. Questions on any of that? Okay. All right. So then what about the wall structure in our veins? Okay. The layers are definitely thinner than the corresponding size in the arteries. Okay. The thickest layer is always going to be the externa in our veins. Okay. This gives some support, gives it some shape, kind of helps to anchor it down to surrounding tissues. The intima is unique because it forms the valves, like we talked about, especially in limb veins. Not all veins have valves, but the ones like in our arms and legs definitely do, because that's where it's really hard to get blood back, especially down in our legs, right? Because we're fighting gravity. Venules are going to be the equivalent of the arterioles right next to the capillary bed, right? And then we have these unique vein type structures called venous sinuses, which are just kind of these big, like open chambers, almost really flat, and they can completely flatten when they're not full of blood, and they open back up. We have these in our heart and in our brain as well. Okay, one pathology with veins, varicose veins. All right, problem with varicose veins is the valves aren't working anymore. Okay, and so what happens is all the blood just pools in our lower extremity, and by putting that extra pressure on our veins, it stretches out the walls, and veins grow when there's extra pressure on them, and they lengthen, and so we get this like kind of, this is a pretty severe case obviously for the slide, but yeah, you can see where that vein has lengthened quite a bit, right? And it's actually like caused this little like meandering, which is like what a river does. Like the older it is, the more it like meanders back and forth, but it's the same idea in your veins. It can be pretty painful. Sitting and not moving for long periods of time is definitely a risk factor. Pregnancy, obesity is definitely a genetic component to this as well. So, okay. All right, so let's just do a quick recap here of the different blood vessels we talked about. So number one, discuss the function of each blood vessel type with your team. And then there's a few questions there to talk about and just one to answer on your clickers. So you're just kind of filling in the function of each of these blood vessel types and then talking about those questions there. Okay, I will open up the clickers for that.
Function allows to get blood somewhere fast. Oh, yes. Did you say that was the same function as arterials?
Not necessarily the same function, just the same. They're like the equivalent of size because they're right on the, not right next to the capillary bed. But
Then what would the function be for that? Just a small veins?
yeah, I mean, they're just, yeah, I don't know what I have for function here. It's just like getting blood back to the heart, I guess, in general. That's what they are. Yeah. Receiving blood from the capillary bed might be what it says underneath that. I can't remember. All right, give you about 5 more seconds. Go ahead and send that in. Most of you already have. That same question as before. All right, a couple more people. Go ahead and send that in. I think we're about there. 100% of you are saying C there. Same question twice. I get it. I like that question though. Hint, hint. But okay. Where does diffusion occur? Which one? Or what? Yeah, maybe it's not a number, or maybe it's not a letter, but where does diffusion occur? Capillaries. There we go. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, blood pressure control is happening at the arterioles. Where is most of the blood found at any given point? What'd you put there? The veins, yeah. So E would be there. Okay. Which of those, or the other ones would be the most abundant? What do you have the most of? We're just like counting length, like we were talking about. Again, it's the one that's not there. It's going to be the capillaries. It's always going to be the smallest ones, right? The smallest ones we have the most of. Okay. If we're just talking about the ones in the image, then it's going to be arterioles and venules for sure. But yeah, here. Yeah, here, now I can show you the function. Yeah, elastic arteries, we're talking about conducting blood under high pressure to organs, muscular arteries, controlling blood flow to organs, but then regulating blood pressure some. All right, arterioles, blood flow to tissues, feeds that capillary bed. Okay, D being just getting the blood from the capillary bed, right? And then E, getting blood back to the heart. Okay. All right, I'll leave that up there for a sec, but we are all done. Have a great rest of your day. We'll see you guys on Wednesday.